The hospital wing's familiar antiseptic smell filled Harry's nostrils as Madame Pomfrey guided him to the nearest bed, her practiced hands already reaching for her wand. Ron and Hermione hovered nearby, still covered in troll dust and debris from their encounter in the girls' bathroom. "Sit still, Potter," Pomfrey instructed briskly, her grey hair pulled back in its usual severe bun. "That troll could have done serious damage, even if you don't feel it yet. Adrenaline masks many injuries." Harry winced as he settled onto the crisp white sheets, his whole body aching from their desperate fight. The memory of the massive creature's club whistling past his head still made him shudder. If Ron hadn't managed that perfect Wingardium Leviosa. "We're fine, honestly," Harry protested weakly, but Pomfrey was already moving her wand in precise patterns above him, muttering diagnostic incantations under her breath. The familiar warmth of healing magic washed over him. She frowned, repeating the movement. "That's odd." "What's odd?" Hermione asked anxiously, stepping closer. Her bushy hair was even more disheveled than usual, and there was a small cut on her cheek that hadn't been properly cleaned yet. Pomfrey's frown deepened as she cast the diagnostic spell a third time. The tip of her wand began to glow with an unusual, silvery light that pulsed rhythmically. "I'm detecting magical signatures that shouldn't be there." "Magical signatures?" Ron echoed, his voice cracking slightly. Harry felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with his injuries. "What kind of signatures?" Pomfrey moved her wand in a more complex pattern, her expression growing increasingly alarmed. The silvery light intensified, and Harry could swear he saw threads of light connecting to various points on his body. "These aren't injury markers or recent spell residue. These are tracking charms." The words hung in the air like a curse. "Tracking charms." Hermione's voice was barely above a whisper. "How many?" Pomfrey's face had gone pale. She cast the diagnostic spell again, this time with a slight modification that made the light shine brighter. Harry could see thin golden threads extending from his body in dozens of directions, some pulsing regularly, others flickering sporadically. 63, Pomfrey breathed, her wand trembling slightly in her hand. "There are 63 separate tracking charms on you, Mr. Potter." The hospital wing fell silent, except for the distant sounds of the Halloween feast continuing in the great hall. Harry felt as if the floor had dropped away beneath him. 63, he managed to croak. "But how? Why?" Pomfrey was studying the magical readout intently, her professional composure warring with obvious shock. "Some of these are quite old. This one here appears to have been placed when you were very young, perhaps as early as infancy." She gestured to a particularly bright golden thread. "And this cluster was added more recently, within the last few months." Ron had gone as pale as nearly headless Nick. Who would put tracking charms on Harry? Pomfrey cast another diagnostic variation, and the golden threads began to differentiate into various colors. Roughly half remained golden, while others shifted to blue, green, and silver. "The magical signatures." Pomfrey paused, clearly struggling with what she was seeing. "Approximately half of these bear the unmistakable signature of Professor Dumbledore." Harry felt the world tilt sideways. "Dumbledore? But why would he—" "I don't understand this," Pomfrey interrupted, her voice tight with concern. "In all my years as a healer, I've never seen anything like this level of surveillance placed on a child. These aren't protective wards or medical monitors. These are active tracking charms designed to report location, activities, even physiological responses." Hermione had pulled out a small notebook and was frantically scribbling notes. "Can you identify the other signatures? The ones that aren't Professor Dumbledore's?" Pomfrey hesitated, clearly debating how much to reveal. Some I recognize from ministry personnel I've encountered. Others, she shook her head. Others are completely unfamiliar to me, and a few have signatures that are quite concerning. Concerning how? Harry asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Dark magic, she said quietly. Not evil necessarily, but secretive, hidden. The kind of spell work that's designed to avoid detection by other magical practitioners. Harry stared down at his hands, trying to process what he was hearing. All his life, he'd felt like an outsider, like he was somehow different. Now it turned out he'd been under constant surveillance by dozens of people he'd never even met. How long have they been there? He asked. The oldest ones. Pomfrey consulted her diagnostic readings again. They appear to date back to early 1981. You would have been barely a year old. Harry's stomach dropped. That meant the tracking had begun around the time his parents died, around the time Dumbledore had placed him with the Dursleys. Can you remove them? Hermione asked practically. Pomfrey looked troubled. Some of them, yes. Others are so deeply integrated into your magical signature that removing them could cause serious harm. And I suspect that attempting to disable Professor Dumbledore's tracking charms without his permission could have significant consequences. Ron finally found his voice again. This is mental. Harry, you've been watched your entire life? The implications were staggering. Every moment of privacy he'd thought he'd had at Privet Drive, every secret conversation, every time he'd practiced magic in secret. It had all been monitored, recorded, analyzed. Why? Harry asked again, his voice barely audible. Why me? Pomfrey had no answer. She simply stood there, her diagnostic spell still active, staring at the web of magical surveillance that surrounded the boy who lived. In the golden glow of the tracking charms, Harry Potter looked less like a hero and more like what he'd apparently always been, a specimen under observation. Professor McGonagall arrived in the hospital wing within minutes of Pomfrey's urgent summons, her emerald robes billowing behind her as she strode through the doors. Her square glasses caught the light as she took in the scene. Harry sitting pale and shaken on the hospital bed, Ron and Hermione flanking him like protective sentries, and Pomfrey standing rigid with her wand still glowing from diagnostic spells. Poppy, what's the meaning of this emergency? McGonagall's voice was crisp with concern. Is Mr. Potter seriously injured? Not injured, Minerva, Pomfrey replied, her tone carefully controlled. But I believe you need to see this immediately, and we'll need the headmaster as well. McGonagall's lips pressed into a thin line at the gravity in Pomfrey's voice. She approached Harry's bedside and noticed the faint, golden threads of light still visible around him from the active diagnostic charm. What exactly am I looking at? Tracking charms, Harry said quietly, his voice hollow. 63 of them. Half of them from Professor Dumbledore. McGonagall's face went through several rapid expressions, confusion, disbelief, and then something that looked distinctly like anger. I beg your pardon. Pomfrey gestured with her wand, and the magical signatures became more pronounced. The diagnostic is quite clear. This child has been under extensive surveillance for most of his life. Some of these charms date back to infancy. That's, McGonagall began, then stopped, staring at the web of golden light surrounding Harry. Her usual composure cracked slightly. Surely there must be some mistake. There's no mistake, came a calm voice from the hospital wing entrance. Professor Dumbledore stood in the doorway, his blue eyes unusually serious behind his half-moon spectacles. He moved forward slowly, his hands clasped behind his back. Albus, McGonagall said sharply, turning to face him. Please tell me you can explain this surveillance network around one of our students." Dumbledore studied the diagnostic readout with the air of someone examining a particularly complex chess problem. "I can explain some of it, Minerva, though I suspect you may not approve of my explanations." "Try me," McGonagall said, her Scottish accent becoming more pronounced as her temper rose. Harry found his voice. "Professor Dumbledore, why are there tracking charms on me? And why so many?" Dumbledore moved closer, his ancient face showing what might have been regret. "Harry, the magical world can be a dangerous place for someone in your unique position. The tracking charms I placed were precautionary measures." "Precautionary measures," Hermione echoed, her notebook still clutched in her hands. "Professor, there are over 30 charms with your signature alone." "Indeed." Dumbledore's acknowledgement was matter-of-fact. "Location monitoring, magical activity detection, physical health indicators, emotional state assessments, all designed to ensure I could respond quickly if you were ever in danger." McGonagall's nostrils flared. "Albus, you've been spying on an 11-year-old boy for his entire life?" "I've been protecting him, Minerva." "By violating his privacy at every turn?" McGonagall's voice was rising. "By monitoring his every move, his every feeling? This is unconscionable." Ron shifted uncomfortably. "But what about the other tracking charms? The ones that aren't from Professor Dumbledore?" Dumbledore's expression darkened slightly. "Those are more concerning. I was not aware of their existence until this moment." Pomfrey stepped forward. "Some bear ministry signatures. Others appear to be from unknown sources, and at least 3 have the hallmarks of dark magic." "Dark magic?" Harry's voice cracked. "Someone's been tracking me with dark magic?" "Not necessarily harmful dark magic," Dumbledore clarified quickly, "but magic designed to avoid detection by conventional means. Magic that operates in shadows and secrecy." McGonagall rounded on the headmaster. "And you saw fit to add to this collection? How could you justify adding more surveillance to a child who was already being monitored by unknown parties?" "Because I needed to ensure his safety." Dumbledore's voice carried a rare note of defensiveness. "Harry is not an ordinary child, Minerva. Forces seek to harm him, to use him, to eliminate him entirely. Every piece of information about his well-being, his location, his magical development, it all helps me keep him alive." Harry felt sick. "You've been watching me with the Dursleys? You knew how they treated me?" Dumbledore's silence stretched long enough to be an answer. "You knew," Harry whispered, and there was something broken in his voice that made Ron and Hermione exchange worried glances. "The situation at your relative's home was less than ideal," Dumbledore admitted, "but it was necessary for your protection. The Blood Wards required me to live there," Harry interrupted, his 11-year-old voice shaking with anger. "They didn't require you to watch my every humiliation, my every moment of pain, and do nothing about it." McGonagall looked between Harry and Dumbledore with growing horror. "Albus, what exactly has this child endured?" "That is not the issue at hand," Dumbledore said firmly. "The issue is that unknown parties have been monitoring Harry without his knowledge or consent, and we must determine their identities and intentions." "Actually," Hermione said quietly, "I think the issue is that everyone has been monitoring Harry without his knowledge or consent, including you, Professor Dumbledore." The hospital wing fell into uncomfortable silence. Pomfrey continued her diagnostic work, the golden threads of tracking magic glowing softly around Harry like a cage made of light. "Can they be removed?" Harry asked finally. "Some can," Pomfrey replied. "Others are too deeply embedded. And Professor Dumbledore's charms. She looked at the headmaster questioningly. My protective monitoring will remain in place, Dumbledore said gently but firmly. I understand your feelings, Harry, but your safety must take precedence over your privacy concerns. McGonagall's face flushed red. His safety, Albus? Or your need for control? Minerva, no. McGonagall's voice was steel. This conversation is far from over, and I suspect it's only the beginning of much larger questions about how we monitor and protect our students. Harry looked down at his hands, still able to see the faint glow of surveillance magic surrounding him. For the first time since learning he was a wizard, he wondered if the magical world was truly any freer than the cupboard under the stairs. The Gryffindor common room felt unusually oppressive, despite the warm fire crackling in the grate. Harry slumped in one of the worn armchairs, staring into the flames while Ron and Hermione occupied the couch nearby. The other first years had long since gone to bed, leaving the trio alone with their troubling discoveries. 63 tracking charms, Hermione murmured, consulting her notebook for the dozenth time. That's not just surveillance, Harry. That's obsessive. Ron shifted uncomfortably. And Dumbledore admitted to placing 30-something of them. What about the rest? Harry pulled his knees up to his chest. Pomfrey said some had ministry signatures, but the others, he shuddered. Dark magic. Someone's been tracking me with dark magic since I was a baby. We need more information, Hermione declared, closing her notebook with a snap. First thing tomorrow, we're going to the library. There has to be something about tracking charms in the magical theory books. What kind of information are we looking for exactly? Ron asked. Types of tracking spells, how they work, who typically uses them. Hermione counted off on her fingers. If we can understand what each charm does, maybe we can figure out who placed the unknown ones. The portrait hole swung open with a soft creak, and Fred and George Weasley climbed through, their faces bright with mischief, until they spotted the serious expressions on the first year's faces. Blimey, Fred said, dropping into a nearby chair. You three look like someone's told you Christmas is cancelled. More like someone's told us we've been under surveillance our entire lives, Ron muttered. George raised an eyebrow. Surveillance? What kind of surveillance? Harry hesitated, then decided the twins might actually be helpful. Do you know anything about tracking charms? Like how many different types there are? The twins exchanged one of their meaningful looks. Depends what you're tracking, Fred said slowly. People, objects, magical signatures. People, Harry said quietly. Specifically, tracking charms on people. That's some pretty advanced magic, George said, his usual jovial tone becoming more serious. Why do you want to know? Ron looked at Harry, who nodded reluctantly. Harry's been tracked, lots of tracking charms. We're trying to figure out who placed them. Fred whistled low. How many is lots? 63, Hermione replied matter-of-factly. Both twins stared. 63? George echoed. That's not tracking, that's a complete surveillance network. What we don't understand, Hermione continued, is why so many different people would be monitoring Harry. Professor Dumbledore admitted to some of them, but there are dozens more. Fred leaned forward, suddenly very serious. Harry, mate, you need to be careful who you trust with this information. If someone's gone to the trouble of placing that many tracking charms on you, they're not going to be happy about you discovering them. The Ministry uses tracking charms on certain sensitive individuals, George added, people they consider dangerous or important. But 63? That's overkill even for them. Harry felt his stomach clench. Dangerous? Do they think I'm dangerous? More likely they think you're important, Fred said. Important enough that everyone wants to keep tabs on you. Hermione opened her notebook again. What types of tracking charms are there? We need to understand what we're dealing with. George considered this. Well, there's location tracking. That tells you where someone is at any given time. Then there's activity monitoring, which tracks what kind of magic someone's performing. Health monitoring charms are popular with worried parents. Emotional state tracking, Fred added grimly. Those are particularly invasive. They monitor your feelings, stress levels, even your sleeping patterns. That's horrible, Ron said, his face pale. Imagine never having a private moment, not even your own thoughts and feelings. Harry stared into the fire, remembering Dumbledore's admission about emotional state assessments. Even his feelings hadn't been his own. There are also what we call trigger charms, George continued. They activate when certain conditions are met. If you go to specific places, meet certain people, perform particular spells. And then there are the really nasty ones, Fred said, his voice dropping. Influence charms masquerading as tracking spells. They don't just monitor behavior. They can subtly alter it. Hermione's quill scratched furiously across her notebook. How can you tell the difference between different types of tracking charms? Each type has a distinct magical signature, George explained. Location trackers pulse regularly like a heartbeat. Activity monitors flicker when magic is used nearby. Emotional trackers have this sort of shifting quality, like they're constantly adjusting to new information. Harry thought about the golden threads Pomfrey had shown them, some pulsing, others flickering. What about the ones that are designed to avoid detection? The twins exchanged another look. Those are dark magic territory, Fred said seriously. Not necessarily evil, but definitely illegal in most circumstances. They're designed to hide from other magical practitioners, which makes them nearly impossible to detect without specialized diagnostic spells. The kind of spells only someone like Madame Pomfrey would know, George added. So whoever placed those charms, Hermione said slowly, they knew about magical detection methods. They knew how to hide their surveillance. Which means they're not amateurs, Ron concluded. Harry stood abruptly, unable to sit still any longer. I need to know who's been watching me, all of them. I need to know why. Be careful, Harry, Fred warned. If these people went to such lengths to hide their monitoring, they won't appreciate you uncovering it. Some of those tracking charms have probably been reporting back to their casters for over 10 years, George added. They know everything about you, where you go, what you do, who you talk to. That gives them a massive advantage. Harry clenched his fists. Then it's time to level the playing field. Hermione looked up from her notes. First step is the library. We need to research every type of tracking charm we can find. If we can identify exactly what each charm does, we can start building a profile of who might have placed them. And then? Ron asked. Harry stared into the fire, his green eyes reflecting the flames. Then we find out who's been watching me, and we make them explain themselves. The common room fell quiet, except for the crackling of the fire. Outside, the November wind rattled the windows of Gryffindor Tower, but none of them noticed. They were too busy planning their investigation into the invisible watchers who had been monitoring Harry Potter's every move since the day he'd entered the wizarding world. The news reached Minister Cornelius Fudge's office on a grey November morning, delivered by a rather flustered-looking junior clerk who knocked hesitantly on the mahogany door of the minister's chambers. "Enter," Fudge called, looking up from a stack of parchments regarding cauldron thickness regulations. The lime-green bowler hat perched on his desk caught the weak sunlight streaming through the windows. "Minister," the clerk began nervously, "we've received an urgent communication from Hogwarts School. It concerns Harry Potter, sir." Fudge's quill paused mid-signature. Any matter involving the boy who lived required immediate attention. What about Potter? Sir, it appears that Mr. Potter has been found to be under extensive magical surveillance. 63 separate tracking charms, according to the report from the school's matron. The clerk's voice grew smaller as he delivered the shocking numbers. Fudge's face went pale, then flushed red. 63? That's preposterous. Who authorized such extensive monitoring of a child? That's just it, sir. The school doesn't know. Professor Dumbledore has admitted to placing approximately 30 charms for protective purposes, but the origins of the remaining 33 are unknown. Some bear ministry signatures. The minister stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Ministry signatures? Which departments? That's unclear, sir. The report suggests we send investigators immediately to assess the situation and determine the legal implications. Within 2 hours, a small delegation of ministry officials had arrived at Hogwarts, their black robes billowing as they strode through the castle corridors toward the headmaster's office. Fudge himself led the group, flanked by 2 investigators from the Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes and Arthur Weasley from the Misuse of Muggle Artifacts office. Arthur had volunteered for the delegation the moment he'd heard Harry Potter's name mentioned. The boy was his son's friend, and the implications of extensive surveillance on an 11-year-old child troubled him deeply. Cornelius, Dumbledore greeted them as they entered his circular office, his blue eyes notably cooler than usual. To what do I owe this unexpected visit? Don't play games, Albus, Fudge replied curtly, settling heavily into the chair across from Dumbledore's desk. We need to discuss the Potter boys' situation. Ah, Dumbledore steepled his fingers. I wondered when the ministry would involve itself. Involve itself? Fudge's voice rose. Albus, there are unauthorized tracking charms on one of your students, charms that apparently include ministry magic. We have a legal obligation to investigate. Arthur cleared his throat. Headmaster, if I may, the legal issues here are quite complex. The trace allows us to monitor magic performed in the vicinity of underage wizards, but it cannot tell us who exactly uses magic in a given area, only that it has been used. What we're describing here goes far beyond the scope of the trace. Indeed it does, agreed one of the investigators, consulting a thick manual. Tracking charms placed without consent on a minor require specific authorization under the Child Welfare and Magical Monitoring Act of 1847. We need to see those authorizations. Dumbledore's expression remained serene. The protective charms I placed on Harry were necessary for his safety. I act under my authority as his magical guardian. Magical guardian? Fudge frowned. The boy lives with Muggle relatives. Who appointed you his magical guardian? The circumstances of Harry's placement were unique, Dumbledore replied carefully. Given the threats to his life, extraordinary protective measures were warranted. Arthur leaned forward. Headmaster, with respect, the law is quite clear. Tracking charms beyond the standard trace require either parental consent or a formal ministry authorization. Harry Potter's Muggle guardians couldn't have given informed consent for magical surveillance, and we have no record of ministry authorization for your protective measures. The second investigator was taking copious notes. And what about the unknown tracking charms, the ones that don't bear Professor Dumbledore's signature? Those, Dumbledore said grimly, are equally concerning to me. I was unaware of their existence until Madame Pomfrey's diagnostic revealed them. Fudge shifted uncomfortably. Some of those charms apparently bear ministry signatures. We need to identify which departments placed them and under what authority. The problem, Arthur explained, is that these unauthorized tracking charms may have been collecting information about Harry for over a decade. If any of that information was shared or used inappropriately, we could be looking at serious violations of wizarding privacy law. Privacy law? Fudge scoffed. Arthur, this is Harry Potter we're discussing, the boy who defeated you-know-who. Surely special circumstances apply equally to protection and to legal oversight, Arthur interrupted firmly. Minister, if we allow unlimited surveillance of children, even famous ones, without proper authorization, where does it end? What prevents similar monitoring of other students? Dumbledore's eyes sharpened. Are you suggesting, Mr. Weasley, that other Hogwarts students may be under surveillance? I'm suggesting, Arthur replied carefully, that we need to audit our monitoring practices to ensure they comply with wizarding law. The trace is specifically designed with limitations to protect privacy. It detects magical activity, but not specific casters. What's been done to Harry Potter circumvents those protections entirely. One of the investigators looked up from his notes. Headmaster, we'll need to interview Mr. Potter directly, and will require access to Madame Pomfrey's complete diagnostic records. That may prove difficult, Dumbledore said. Harry has been understandably distressed by these revelations. Adding ministry questioning to his burden seems unwise. Fudge's face reddened. Unwise? Albus, we have potentially dozens of unauthorized magical monitors on a child, some placed using dark magic, according to your school's medical report. This isn't a matter of what's convenient for the boy, this is a matter of magical law enforcement. And yet, Dumbledore replied mildly, Hogwarts has traditionally maintained a degree of autonomy in matters concerning its students. Autonomy doesn't extend to ignoring violations of wizarding privacy law, Arthur said. Minister, I recommend we establish a formal investigation committee. We need to identify every tracking charm, determine who placed them, and assess whether any laws were broken. The tension in the room was palpable. Fudge looked between Dumbledore and his own investigators, clearly caught between his respect for the headmaster and his obligation to enforce ministry law. Very well, Fudge said finally. We'll establish a joint committee, ministry investigators working with Hogwarts staff. But Albus, I want full cooperation. No more secrets about Potter's protection arrangements. Dumbledore inclined his head slightly. I will cooperate within the bounds of what I believe serves Harry's best interests. That, Arthur said quietly, is exactly the kind of attitude that got us into this situation in the first place. As the ministry delegation prepared to leave, Arthur lingered behind. Headmaster, I have a personal request. Harry Potter is my son's friend. Ron has been deeply affected by these revelations. I'd like to ensure that whatever investigation occurs, it considers the impact on the children involved. Dumbledore studied Arthur thoughtfully. Your concern for the boys is noted, Arthur. Perhaps the ministry's involvement will ultimately serve their interests better than my unilateral protection efforts. Arthur nodded grimly. Perhaps it will. But one thing is certain. This investigation is going to change everything for Harry Potter. The question is whether it changes things for the better. The ministry investigators had been at Hogwarts for 3 days when they made the discovery that would shake Harry's understanding of his life even more profoundly than the initial revelation of 63 tracking charms. Arthur Weasley found Harry in the library, hunched over a stack of books about magical monitoring, while Hermione scribbled notes and Ron dozed fitfully in a nearby chair. The investigation had taken its toll on all 3 first years, but Harry looked particularly haggard, dark circles under his green eyes, testament to sleepless nights. Harry, Arthur said gently, settling into the chair across from him. I need to speak with you about what we've discovered. Harry looked up, his expression wary. In the past few days, every new piece of information had only made his situation seem more invasive and disturbing. "We've been analyzing the tracking charms in detail," Arthur continued, his voice carefully controlled. "And we've found something unexpected." Hermione's quill paused. "What kind of unexpected?" Arthur glanced around the library, ensuring they were alone among the towering bookshelves. 17 of the tracking charms appear to be specifically designed to monitor Harry's activities at Privet Drive. Not just his presence there, but detailed behavioral monitoring, sleep patterns, stress levels, interactions with your relatives. Harry felt the blood drain from his face. "Someone's been watching me at the Dursleys?" "Multiple someones," Arthur said grimly. "The magical signatures are diverse. Some appear to be from what we're calling community watch networks, informal groups of witches and wizards who monitor Muggle neighborhoods where magical children live." Ron jerked awake at the serious tone. "Community watch? It's more common than you might think," Arthur explained. "When magical children live in entirely Muggle households, certain concerned parties sometimes establish monitoring to ensure their welfare. Usually it's limited to basic safety checks, but in Harry's case, in my case, it was comprehensive surveillance," Harry finished bitterly. Arthur nodded reluctantly. "The level of detail is extraordinary. These charms tracked everything from your physical health to your emotional state to your interactions with your Muggle relatives. They've been reporting back for over 10 years. Hermione looked horrified. "But who were they reporting to?" "That's what's particularly disturbing," Arthur said. "Several of the signatures trace back to organizations we didn't even know existed. Hidden magical communities, protective societies, even what appears to be a network of concerned Hogwarts graduates who've been keeping an eye on you." Harry stared down at his hands. "So not only has Dumbledore been watching me and the Ministry and whoever placed those dark magic trackers, but also random witches and wizards who decided I needed monitoring." "Harry," Arthur said carefully, "some of these groups may have had genuinely protective intentions. When word spread through certain circles that the boy who lived was living with Muggle relatives, many people became concerned about your welfare." "Concerned enough to spy on me constantly?" Harry's voice cracked. "Mr. Weasley, I haven't had a private moment since I was a baby. Every time I was locked in my cupboard, every time my uncle shouted at me, every time I cried myself to sleep, someone was watching." The library fell silent. Arthur's face had gone pale at the mention of Harry being locked in a cupboard. "Harry," Arthur said slowly, "what do you mean, locked in your cupboard?" Too late, Harry realized he'd revealed more than he intended. He glanced at Ron and Hermione, both of whom were staring at him with growing horror. "The Dursleys," Harry said quietly. They don't like magic. They made me live in the cupboard under the stairs until I got my Hogwarts letter." Arthur's hands clenched into fists. "They locked you in a cupboard? For 10 years?" "It wasn't that bad," Harry said quickly, though his voice lacked conviction. "I mean, it was small, but—" "Harry!" Hermione interrupted, her voice shaking. "That's child abuse." "But all these people were watching," Ron said, his face flushed with anger. "All these protective societies and community watch groups and concerned graduates. They knew how you were being treated, and they did nothing." Arthur stood abruptly, pacing to the nearby window. "This changes everything. If these monitoring groups were collecting detailed information about Harry's treatment by his relatives and failed to intervene—" "They were complicit," Hermione said flatly. "They turned Harry's suffering into a spectator sport." Harry felt something cold and hollow spreading in his chest. How many people knew? How many people watched me live in that cupboard and decided it was acceptable? Arthur turned back to them, his face grim. Based on the tracking charm signatures, we estimate that information about your living conditions was being shared among at least 12 different magical organizations. 12? Harry repeated numbly. Some of the more recent tracking charms appear to have been placed by people who were monitoring the monitors, Arthur continued. Groups that became concerned about the level of surveillance you were under and decided to conduct their own oversight. Ron's voice was incredulous. So Harry was being watched by people who were watching the people who were already watching him. In essence, yes. Harry laughed, a bitter sound that echoed among the library shelves. I'm not a person. I'm a project, a case study, something to be observed and analyzed and discussed. Harry, no, Arthur said firmly. You're a child who deserved protection and privacy, and the adults in the magical world failed you, all of us. But why? Harry's voice was barely a whisper. Why was everyone so interested in watching me? Why couldn't they just leave me alone? Arthur sat back down, his expression troubled. Because you're Harry Potter. Because you survived the killing curse and defeated the most dangerous dark wizard in a century when you were barely a year old. People became invested in your story. My story, Harry repeated. Not my life. My story. The blood protection at Privet Drive was supposed to keep you safe, Arthur said. But somewhere along the way, the magical community turned your protection into an excuse for unprecedented surveillance. Everyone wanted to be part of the Harry Potter narrative. Hermione was furiously scribbling in her notebook. This is massive. Harry, there's been a systematic violation of your privacy by dozens of people and organizations, all justified by your fame. And now that it's been exposed, Ron added, they're all scrambling to cover their tracks. Harry stood up from the table, his movements sharp with suppressed emotion. I need some air. Harry, Arthur began. No, Harry said firmly. I need to think. I just need some time alone, if that's even possible anymore. As Harry walked away, Arthur watched him with deep concern. Behind them, Hermione continued taking notes, documenting the systematic betrayal of a child's privacy by the very community that claimed to cherish him. The boy who lived had survived Voldemort's killing curse, but the magical world's obsessive attention might prove to be an even more insidious threat to the person he was trying to become. Madame Pomfrey stood in the center of the hospital wing, her wand held steady as she performed diagnostic scans on a nervous-looking Neville Longbottom. Harry, Ron, and Hermione watched from nearby beds, having volunteered to provide moral support for their fellow Gryffindor first years who had agreed to be tested. The decision to scan other students had come from Pomfrey herself, who had grown increasingly troubled by the implications of Harry's surveillance. If one student could be monitored so extensively, she reasoned, others might be as well. Hold still, Mr. Longbottom, Pomfrey murmured, moving her wand in the now familiar diagnostic pattern. The silvery light began to glow, and Harry held his breath, hoping desperately that Neville would be free of the tracking charms that had turned Harry's life into a surveillance exercise. The light intensified, and thin golden threads began to appear around Neville's stocky form. Oh dear, Pomfrey sighed. How many? Hermione asked quietly. Pomfrey cast the spell again, her expression growing more troubled with each repetition. 15 tracking charms, not as extensive as Mr. Potter's situation, but far more than should ever be placed on an 11-year-old child. Neville's face had gone pale. But why? I'm not famous like Harry. I haven't done anything special. Harry felt a sick recognition in his stomach. Neville, you're the other boy who could have been chosen instead of me. The prophecy could have applied to you just as easily. Indeed, Pomfrey said grimly. Mr. Longbottom, given your family's tragic circumstances and your potential significance, it appears certain parties have decided you warrant monitoring as well. The reminder of Neville's parents, permanently hospitalized at St. Mungo's after being tortured into insanity by Death Eaters, hung heavy in the air. Neville ducked his head, clearly uncomfortable with the attention his family's tragedy had brought him. "Next!" Pomfrey called, and Dean Thomas approached hesitantly. The scan revealed 3 tracking charms, fewer than Neville's, but still a violation of his privacy. Seamus Finnegan had 5. When they scanned the girls, Hermione showed 4 tracking charms, while Parvati and Lavender each had 2. "This is systematic," Hermione said, frantically taking notes as each new violation was revealed. "Every first-year Gryffindor has been monitored to some degree." Percy Weasley arrived in the hospital wing, just as Pomfrey was finishing the scans, his prefect badge gleaming on his robes. He had been summoned by Professor McGonagall to observe the proceedings and provide an official student perspective. "This is highly irregular," Percy announced, though his voice lacked its usual authority. The scope of the surveillance had clearly shaken even his confidence in proper procedures. Students should not be subjected to unauthorized magical monitoring. "No kidding," Ron muttered. Percy shot his younger brother a stern look, then turned to Pomfrey. "Madam Pomfrey, as a prefect, I must ask, are you planning to scan students from other houses as well?" "Professor McGonagall has requested that we expand the investigation to include all first years initially," Pomfrey replied. "If we find evidence of widespread monitoring, we may need to test the entire student body." "The entire student body?" Dean's voice cracked. "You mean everyone at Hogwarts might be under surveillance?" "It's looking increasingly likely," Pomfrey said grimly. Word of the expanded scanning had already begun to spread through the castle, and by evening, the Gryffindor common room was buzzing with nervous energy. Students clustered in small groups, whispering about tracking charms and unauthorized monitoring. "I can't believe this," Lavender said, her usually bubbly demeanor subdued. "I mean, my parents know I'm at Hogwarts, obviously, but someone else has been watching me too, without telling my family." "At least you only have 2 charms," Seamus pointed out. "Poor Neville's got 15. Neville, who had been unusually quiet all evening, finally spoke up. "I keep thinking about my grandmother. She never mentioned anything about tracking charms. Either she doesn't know someone's been monitoring me, or—" He trailed off, unwilling to voice the possibility that his own family might be involved. "Or she's been kept in the dark, just like the rest of us," Dean finished. Harry felt a familiar weight settling on his shoulders. Once again, his situation had led to problems for his friends. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "If I hadn't been discovered with all those tracking charms, none of you would be going through this." "Don't be ridiculous," Hermione said firmly. "Harry, you didn't create this surveillance network, and it's better that we know about it now than continue living under secret monitoring." Percy, who had been listening to the conversation with growing concern, stood up from his chair by the fire. "As prefect, I feel I should point out that if unauthorized tracking charms have been placed on students, the responsible parties have committed serious violations of wizarding law. The school administration and the ministry have an obligation to investigate and prosecute." "Easy for you to say," Ron replied. "You're probably not being monitored because you're not famous or important." Percy's face flushed. "I'll have you know that prefects often receive additional scrutiny from school officials. I wouldn't be surprised if I have tracking charms as well." "Really?" Hermione looked up from her notes with interest. "We should ask Madam Pomfrey to scan you too." "That won't be necessary," Percy said stiffly, but his confident demeanor had wavered slightly. The common room fell silent as the implications sank in. If even prefects might be under surveillance, then the monitoring network was far more extensive than any of them had imagined. How long do you think this has been going on? Parvati asked. Based on Harry's situation, probably for decades, Hermione replied. This isn't something that started recently. It's an established system. Harry stared into the fire, watching the flames dance in the grate. Each new revelation made him feel less like a person and more like a specimen in some vast, invisible experiment. But now it wasn't just him. His friends, his classmates, potentially hundreds of students had been reduced to subjects worthy of secret observation. What do we do about it? Neville asked quietly. We find out who's responsible, Harry said, his voice hardening with determination. And we make them answer for what they've done to all of us. The first years looked at each other with a mixture of fear and resolve. They had come to Hogwarts expecting to learn magic, but instead they had discovered that they were the ones being studied, watched, monitored, and analyzed by invisible observers who considered their privacy expendable. For the students of Gryffindor House, the magic of Hogwarts had lost some of its wonder, replaced by the unsettling knowledge that even within the castle walls, they were never truly alone. The headmaster's office was quiet, except for the soft ticking of various magical instruments and the occasional rustle from one of the sleeping portraits lining the walls. Harry sat stiffly in the chair across from Dumbledore's desk, his hands clenched in his lap, as he waited for an explanation that could somehow make sense of a lifetime of surveillance. Dumbledore's blue eyes were unusually serious behind his half-moon spectacles, and for once, his typical aura of benevolent mystery seemed subdued. The discovery that tracking charms extended beyond Harry to other students had forced this private meeting, one that Harry had both demanded and dreaded. You wanted to know why, Harry, Dumbledore said quietly, his voice carrying none of its usual warmth. I believe you deserve a complete answer, even if it may be difficult to hear. Harry kept his face carefully neutral. I'm listening. Dumbledore leaned back in his chair, his long fingers steepled before him. You must understand, first and foremost, that Tom Riddle, Lord Voldemort, is not truly gone. The night he tried to kill you, when your mother's love protected you, his physical form was destroyed, but his essence, his soul, survived. A chill ran down Harry's spine. He had known somehow that Voldemort wasn't truly dead, but hearing it confirmed was still unsettling. I have known since that Halloween night that he would return, Dumbledore continued. The question was not if, but when and how. And when he does return, you will once again be his primary target. Because I survived his killing curse, Harry said flatly. Because you represent something he cannot understand or tolerate, proof that love is more powerful than his magic. Your survival was not merely fortunate, Harry. It was impossible by all known magical laws. That impossibility threatens the very foundation of Voldemort's beliefs about power and supremacy. Harry absorbed this, feeling the weight of being marked for death before he could even walk. So you've been watching me to keep me safe from him. Among other reasons, yes. Dumbledore's expression grew more complex. The blood protection your mother gave you through her sacrifice is extraordinarily powerful, Harry. It lives within you, but it required careful cultivation and monitoring to ensure it remained strong. The blood protection at Privet Drive, Harry said, remembering the research he'd done with Hermione. You placed me with the Dursleys to maintain it. Your Aunt Petunia shares your mother's blood. When she took you into her home, the bond of blood charm sealed your mother's protection around you both. As long as you could call that place home, Voldemort could not touch you there. Harry felt a familiar anger rising. But you've been monitoring me constantly, not just checking if I was safe, watching everything I did, everything I felt. Dumbledore nodded slowly. The tracking charms I placed were comprehensive, yes. Location monitoring to ensure you remained within protected areas. Health monitoring to detect any magical attacks or curses. Emotional monitoring to assess your psychological well-being and development. Emotional monitoring, Harry repeated, his voice tight with controlled fury. You were watching my feelings, my private thoughts and reactions. Not your thoughts, Harry. I would never violate your mind in such a way. But your emotional states, yes. The development of your character, your resilience, your capacity for both light and dark magic. These things matter enormously, given your destined conflict with Voldemort. Harry stood abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked the grounds. You were studying me. Like an experiment. I was protecting you, Dumbledore said firmly. Every piece of information the tracking charms provided helped me make decisions about your safety, your placement, your preparation for the challenges ahead. My preparation? Harry turned back to face the headmaster. You knew how the Dursleys treated me. The emotional monitoring would have told you exactly how miserable I was, how afraid, how damaged they were making me. And you left me there anyway. Dumbledore's ancient face showed something that might have been pain. The blood protection required that you remain with your mother's blood relative until you came of age. I could not remove you from Petunia's care without sacrificing the strongest magical defense you possessed. So you chose my protection over my happiness, over my childhood. Harry's voice was shaking now. You decided that keeping me alive was worth letting me suffer for 10 years. I made the choices I believed would give you the best chance of surviving to adulthood, Dumbledore replied, his voice heavy with something Harry had never heard from him before. Doubt. I do not claim they were easy choices, or even the right ones. Only that they were the choices I could live with. Harry stared at him, seeing the great wizard with new eyes. The other tracking charms, the 30-something signatures that weren't yours. You didn't know about those? I did not. That discovery has been troubling. It suggests that others have been monitoring you without my knowledge or consent. Some of those signatures concern me greatly. Because they're dark magic? Because they suggest that Voldemort's followers may have been tracking you as well. If Death Eaters have been monitoring your movements and development, they may be planning something that requires detailed knowledge of your habits and capabilities. The implications hit Harry like a physical blow. Not only had he been under protective surveillance his entire life, but potentially hostile forces had been studying him as well, gathering intelligence for some future attack. How much of my life has actually been my own? Harry asked quietly. Dumbledore was silent for a long moment. Less than you deserved, I fear. But Harry, you must understand, your life has never been entirely your own. From the moment the prophecy was spoken, from the moment Voldemort marked you as his equal, your destiny became intertwined with the fate of our entire world. The prophecy? Dumbledore hesitated, clearly debating how much to reveal. A prediction was made before your birth about a child who would have the power to defeat Voldemort. That prophecy is why he targeted you as an infant, and why he will target you again when he returns. Harry felt as though the ground was shifting beneath his feet. So not only have I been under surveillance my entire life, but my entire future has been predetermined by some prophecy? Not predetermined, Harry. Prophecies create possibilities, not certainties. You will always have choices. What choices? Harry's voice was bitter. What choice did I have about living with the Dursleys? What choice did I have about being monitored every moment of my life? What choice do I have about fighting Voldemort when he returns? You have the choice of how you face these challenges, the choice of who you become despite the circumstances forced upon you, the choice of whether to let fear or love guide your actions. Harry turned back to the window, watching the November wind bend the trees on the grounds. And the tracking charms will continue. Some of them must, yes. Your safety remains paramount. But Harry... Dumbledore paused, choosing his words carefully. Perhaps it is time we discussed your role in monitoring the monitoring. You deserve some measure of control over how your protection operates. It was the closest thing to an apology Harry was likely to get, and perhaps the first time anyone had suggested he might have agency in his own protection. It wasn't enough to erase the violation he felt, or the betrayal of learning that his entire childhood had been observed and analyzed. But it was, possibly, a beginning. I want to know, Harry said finally, still facing the window. Everything, every tracking charm, every person watching me, every decision made about my life. No more secrets. Some secrets exist to protect you, Harry. Harry turned back to face Dumbledore, his green eyes blazing with determination. Then let me decide what protection I'm willing to accept and what privacy I'm willing to sacrifice. I'm tired of other people making those choices for me. For the first time in their conversation, Dumbledore smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. You are very much your mother's son, Harry, and perhaps it is time I trusted in that strength rather than trying to shield you from it. The conversation was far from over, and Harry's anger was far from resolved. But something had shifted between them, the first acknowledgement that Harry Potter, the boy who lived, might also be Harry Potter, the person with rights to autonomy and choice. The Ministry's senior curse-breaker arrived at Hogwarts on a grey November morning, carrying a briefcase full of specialized detection equipment that clicked and hummed ominously as he set up his analysis station in an unused classroom. Arthur Weasley watched nervously as the expert began his deep examination of the most concerning tracking charm signatures found on Harry Potter. What exactly are you looking for? Arthur asked, observing the complex array of magical instruments being arranged with precise care. Dark magic leaves traces, the curse-breaker replied without looking up. His name was Kingsley Shacklebolt, and his reputation for uncovering hidden malicious enchantments was well established within the Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes. Not just the magic itself, but the intent behind it. Protective charms and hostile surveillance spells may use similar techniques, but they feel different to someone who knows what to look for. The main piece of equipment, a crystalline device that resembled a cross between a telescope and a music box, began to glow as Shacklebolt adjusted its settings. He had collected samples of the most suspicious magical signatures from Madame Pomfrey's diagnostic records, and now he was subjecting them to analysis far more sophisticated than anything the school's medical equipment could provide. There, Shacklebolt said suddenly, his voice tight with concern. This signature here, it's definitely hostile. Not protective monitoring, not benign surveillance. This charm was designed to gather intelligence about Mr. Potter's capabilities, vulnerabilities, and daily routines for offensive purposes. Arthur leaned closer to examine the readout, though the complex magical formulae were beyond his expertise. Can you tell who placed it? The magical signature is unusual. Layered. There's a primary caster, but underneath that, there's something else. Something much darker and more powerful. Shacklebolt's frown deepened as he adjusted the instruments. It's almost as if the charm was placed by one person, but is being controlled or influenced by another magical presence. Possession, Arthur breathed, the implications hitting him immediately. Someone casting magic while under the influence of a more powerful wizard. That would be my assessment. Yes, and Arthur. Shacklebolt looked up with genuine alarm in his eyes. This hostile tracking charm was placed recently, within the last few months. Someone inside Hogwarts has been gathering intelligence about Harry Potter for dark purposes. Meanwhile, in the Defense Against the Dark Arts classroom, Professor Quirrell stood at the front of the room, attempting to teach a lesson on protective charms to a class of first-year Gryffindors and Hufflepuffs. His usual nervous stutter seemed more pronounced than ever, and his hands trembled visibly as he demonstrated wand movements. Now, the basic P-protean charm requires precise focus, Quirrell stammered, his turban slightly askew as he fumbled with his wand. Any distraction can cause the charm to fail. Harry watched his defense professor with growing suspicion. Ever since the investigation into tracking charms had begun, Quirrell had seemed increasingly agitated. During meals in the Great Hall, Harry had noticed the professor's eyes frequently darting toward him, and more than once he had caught Quirrell watching him with an intensity that made his scar prickle uncomfortably. "Professor Quirrell seems really nervous lately," Hermione whispered during the lesson. "More than usual, I mean." "Maybe he's worried about the investigation," Ron suggested quietly. "If someone at Hogwarts has been placing tracking charms on students, all the teachers are probably under scrutiny." But Harry wasn't convinced it was simple nervousness. There was something desperate in Quirrell's demeanor, something that reminded him uncomfortably of a cornered animal, and his scar had been aching more frequently, especially when he was near the defense professor. The lesson was interrupted by a knock on the classroom door. Professor McGonagall entered, her expression grave. "Professor Quirrell, you're needed in the headmaster's office immediately. Mr. Potter, you should come as well." Harry felt his stomach drop. The way McGonagall avoided eye contact and the tension in her voice suggested that whatever had been discovered was serious. In Dumbledore's office, the atmosphere was thick with barely controlled alarm. Kingsley Shacklebolt stood near the headmaster's desk, his curse-breaking equipment still humming softly. Dumbledore's usual calm demeanor showed cracks of genuine concern, while Arthur Weasley paced near the window. "Professor Quirrell," Dumbledore said as they entered, his blue eyes more piercing than Harry had ever seen them. "We need to discuss the results of our investigation into the unauthorized tracking charms placed on Mr. Potter." Quirrell's face went pale beneath his turban. I don't understand, Headmaster. What do tracking charms have to do with me?" Shacklebolt stepped forward, consulting a parchment covered in complex magical notation. "Professor Quirrell, our analysis has revealed that one of the hostile surveillance charms placed on Mr. Potter bears magical signatures consistent with your unique magical patterns." "That's ridiculous," Quirrell stammered, but his voice lacked conviction. "I would never." "The signature suggests the charm was cast while you were under the influence of another magical presence," Shacklebolt continued relentlessly. "A much more powerful magical presence that was directing your actions." Harry's scar gave a sharp twinge of pain, and suddenly everything clicked into place. The way his scar hurt whenever he was near Quirrell, the professor's increasing nervousness as the investigation progressed, the Halloween night when Quirrell had conveniently announced the troll in the dungeons, providing a perfect distraction. "You," Harry said quietly, staring at Quirrell with growing certainty. "You're the one who's been feeding information to him." Quirrell's facade began to crumble. The nervous stammering fell away, replaced by something cold and calculating. "Clever boy, but not clever enough to realize how long you've been watched, how much we know about your precious blood protections, your daily routines, your friendships and fears." Dumbledore rose from his chair, his wand appearing in his hand with fluid grace. "Tom, I wondered when you would reveal yourself." "Hello, Albus." Quirrell's voice was still his own, but the tone was entirely different, colder, more confident, filled with malicious satisfaction. "Did you really think your precious tracking charms were the only ones monitoring the boy? I have been watching Harry Potter far longer and far more thoroughly than your crude protective measures." "The Philosopher's Stone," Harry said suddenly, remembering the forbidden third-floor corridor. "You've been trying to steal it." "The stone is merely a means to an end," Quirrell replied, his hand moving unconsciously toward his turban. "But yes, having detailed intelligence about your movements and capabilities has been quite useful in planning my acquisition of it." Arthur stepped forward, his wand also drawn. "You've been using a child as an unwitting spy against himself, gathering intelligence about his protections to help you break through Hogwarts's defenses." "I've been preparing for my return," Quirrell said, and for a moment Harry could swear he heard another voice speaking alongside the professor's, something high and cold that made his scar burn with remembered pain. And Harry Potter has been most accommodating in providing the information necessary to destroy him. The revelation that one of his teachers had been monitoring him, not for protection, but for targeting, filled Harry with a cold rage, unlike anything he had experienced. Every lesson, every interaction, every moment of supposed safety at Hogwarts had been compromised by hostile surveillance gathering intelligence for his greatest enemy. "How long?" Harry asked, his voice steady despite the fury building inside him. "How long have you been watching me for him?" Quirrell smiled, and it was a terrible expression on his normally nervous face. "Since the moment you set foot in Diagon Alley, Harry Potter, every step of your magical awakening has been observed, analyzed, and reported. You have no secrets from Lord Voldemort?" "None at all." The temperature in the office seemed to drop several degrees as the name was spoken aloud. Harry realized with dawning horror that his entire first year at Hogwarts, every friendship formed, every spell learned, every moment of happiness or vulnerability, had been under the scrutiny of the wizard who wanted him dead. The tracking charms had been more than an invasion of privacy. They had been reconnaissance for war. The emergency staff meeting convened in the Great Hall after the evening meal, with all the house tables pushed aside to make room for a large circular arrangement of chairs. The revelation that Professor Quirrell had been conducting hostile surveillance on behalf of Voldemort had shaken the faculty profoundly, forcing them to confront the reality that their protective measures had been woefully inadequate. Professor McGonagall sat stiffly in her chair, her lips pressed into a thin line as she reviewed the agenda Dumbledore had prepared. The discovery that one of their own colleagues had been gathering intelligence for dark purposes had called into question every aspect of Hogwarts's security protocols. "We must address two critical issues," Dumbledore began, his usual grandfatherly demeanor replaced by grim determination. "First, how to properly protect our students from external threats. And second, how to do so without violating their fundamental rights to privacy and autonomy." Professor Snape, seated to Dumbledore's left, looked distinctly uncomfortable with the proceedings. His dark eyes swept the assembled faculty with barely concealed irritation. "Headmaster, with respect, the protection of students must take precedence over their comfort with monitoring. We are dealing with forces that would not hesitate to kill children to achieve their goals." "Severus," Professor Sprout interjected gently, her round face creased with concern. "We've seen what excessive monitoring can do to young minds. Mr. Potter and his classmates have been traumatized by the discovery of unauthorized surveillance. We cannot address one threat by creating another." Snape's lip curled. "Traumatized? Potter and his friends are alive and unharmed. That is more than can be said for many who have faced the Dark Lord's attention without adequate protection. But protection at what cost? McGonagall asked sharply. Severus, these children deserve some measure of privacy and agency in their own lives. What good is it to protect their bodies if we destroy their sense of autonomy and trust? Dumbledore raised a hand to forestall further argument. I have been considering a compromise solution. Rather than unilateral adult monitoring, perhaps we should involve the students themselves in determining appropriate protective measures. The suggestion caused murmurs of surprise around the circle of chairs. Professor Flitwick, perched on a cushion to bring him to the same height as his colleagues, squeaked in amazement. Involve the students? But surely children cannot be expected to understand the complexities of magical protection. They understand the complexities of feeling violated and watched, Professor Sprout said firmly, and they've proven themselves quite capable of research and analysis throughout this investigation. Perhaps it's time we treated them as partners rather than subjects. Snape's expression grew even more sour. This is precisely the kind of sentimental nonsense that allowed Quirrell to operate undetected. Students are not equipped to make decisions about their own security. And yet, McGonagall countered, our adult decision-making allowed a Death Eater to monitor and manipulate them for months. Perhaps some fresh perspectives would be valuable. Dumbledore nodded thoughtfully. I propose we establish a joint committee, faculty and student representatives working together to develop new monitoring protocols. Students would have input on what protective measures they find acceptable, while faculty would ensure that genuine security needs are met. Professor Sprout leaned forward eagerly. I could contribute some alternatives that might address both concerns. My research into magical botany has revealed several plant-based monitoring systems that are far less invasive than traditional tracking charms. Plant-based monitoring? Flitwick asked, with genuine curiosity. Certain magical plants can be attuned to specific individuals without placing any charms directly on the person, Sprout explained. For example, a properly cultivated tracking thyme planted in a protected garden can monitor the general well-being and location of bonded individuals without the invasive psychological monitoring we've seen with traditional charms. Snape looked skeptical. And how effective would these botanical alternatives be against determined dark wizards? They wouldn't prevent attacks, Sprout admitted, but they would provide early warning systems and basic health monitoring without the extensive behavioral surveillance that has so troubled the students. It's a compromise. Some protection without the feeling of constant observation. McGonagall made notes on a piece of parchment. What about involving the students directly in their own protection, teaching them to detect and resist hostile monitoring? An interesting idea, Dumbledore mused. Advanced defensive techniques as part of their curriculum rather than passive protection imposed upon them. You're all avoiding the central issue, Snape said coldly. Potter remains a target. The Dark Lord is not gone, merely displaced. Any protective measures that prioritize the boy's comfort over his survival are ultimately meaningless. Severus, Dumbledore said gently, Harry's psychological well-being is as important as his physical safety. A boy who grows up feeling like a prisoner of his own protection may survive to adulthood. But what kind of man will he become? The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the Great Hall doors. Percy Weasley entered, looking unusually nervous despite his prefect badge. Headmaster, you asked me to represent the student perspective in these discussions. Indeed, Mr. Weasley. Please, join us. Dumbledore gestured to an empty chair that had been prepared for student representation. Percy settled into his seat, his formal demeanor slightly shaken by being included in faculty discussions. Headmaster, I've spoken with students from all 4 houses, and there's been a great deal of discussion about forming a proper student council to address privacy concerns." "A student council?" McGonagall asked with interest. "Yes, Professor. Students feel that they should have some say in policies that affect their daily lives. Not just monitoring, but other school rules and procedures as well. The tracking charm discovery has made many of us realize how little control we have over our own educational experience." Snape's eyebrows rose. "And you believe children are qualified to make such decisions?" Percy straightened, his confidence returning. "With respect, Professor Snape, students are the ones living with the consequences of these policies. We may not have adult experience, but we have direct insight into how these measures affect our daily lives, our relationships with teachers, and our sense of security at Hogwarts." Professor Sprout smiled approvingly. "That's very well said, Mr. Weasley. What specific proposals has this potential student council developed?" "We'd like transparent monitoring. If protective charms are placed on students, we should know what they are and what they monitor. We'd like the right to request removal of non-essential surveillance, and we'd like regular meetings between student representatives and faculty to address concerns before they become crises." Dumbledore nodded thoughtfully. "Reasonable requests. And regarding Mr. Potter specifically?" "He remains in unique danger." Percy shifted uncomfortably. "Harry has expressed willingness to accept necessary protective measures, but he wants to understand and consent to them, rather than simply having them imposed. He's particularly interested in learning defensive skills that would reduce his need for passive monitoring." "The boy wants to take responsibility for his own protection," McGonagall observed. "That's actually quite mature." Snape remained unconvinced. "Potter is 11 years old. His willingness to accept risk does not negate our obligation to protect him, whether he likes it or not." "But perhaps," Dumbledore said slowly, "we can find ways to involve him in that protection, rather than making him a passive recipient of it. Active participation in his own defense, rather than merely enduring our surveillance." Professor Sprout clapped her hands together. "A gardening analogy, if I may. A plant that's overprotected in a greenhouse often struggles when exposed to natural conditions, but a plant that's gradually acclimated to challenges while receiving appropriate support grows strong and resilient." "Potter is not a plant, Pomona," Snape said dryly. "No, but the principle applies. We need to help these children develop their own defenses, rather than simply surrounding them with restrictions and surveillance." As the meeting continued into the evening, a new framework began to emerge, one that balanced the legitimate need for student protection with respect for their autonomy and privacy. It wasn't perfect, and Snape remained unconvinced, but it represented a fundamental shift from the paternalistic surveillance that had characterized Harry's entire magical education. The changes wouldn't erase the violation that had already occurred, but they offered hope that future students might experience protection without feeling like prisoners of their own safety. The Hogwarts Library had never seen such dedicated research from first-year students. For 3 weeks following the staff meeting that established new monitoring protocols, Hermione had claimed a corner table near the restricted section, surrounded by towering stacks of books on defensive magic, detection spells, and counter-surveillance techniques. "I think I've found something," she announced to Harry and Ron as they joined her one grey December morning. Her notebook was filled with cramped handwriting, diagrams, and magical formulae that made Ron's head spin just looking at them. "What kind of something?" Harry asked, settling into the chair beside her. He had dark circles under his eyes from another night of restless sleep. Dreams filled with eyes watching him from shadows had become increasingly common since the tracking charm discovery. "A detection spell specifically designed to reveal monitoring magic," Hermione said excitedly, pointing to a passage in a thick tome titled defensive enchantments for the concerned citizen. It's called the awareness charm, sensus observare. According to this, it makes any tracking or monitoring magic visible to the naked eye for approximately 10 minutes. Ron leaned forward with interest. So we could actually see if someone's placed new tracking charms on us? Exactly. And more importantly, the book says the charm can be modified to provide ongoing protection, a sort of magical alarm that alerts you when new monitoring magic is being cast in your vicinity. Harry felt a spark of hope for the first time in weeks. You mean we could know immediately if someone tries to place tracking charms on us again? That's the theory, Hermione said, though her expression remained cautious. The magic is quite advanced for first years, but I think we could manage it with practice. The problem is that we need somewhere safe to practice without being detected ourselves. Hagrid's hut, Ron suggested immediately. He's always willing to help Harry, and it's far enough from the castle that we won't accidentally trigger any existing protective wards. And Hagrid might know some anti-tracking methods himself, Harry added, remembering the gamekeeper's resourcefulness during their previous adventures. He's been around Hogwarts for decades. He probably knows all kinds of defensive tricks. That evening, the three friends made their way down to Hagrid's hut as the first snow of winter began to fall. The warm glow from the windows was welcoming after the cold walk from the castle, and Hagrid's face lit up when he opened the door to find them on his doorstep. "Harry! Ron! Hermione!" he boomed, ushering them inside where Fang the boarhound sprawled near the fire. Come in! Come in! Just put the kettle on. I did." As they settled around Hagrid's scrubbed wooden table with cups of his famously strong tea, Hermione explained their research and their desire to learn protective techniques that would give them more control over their own monitoring. Hagrid's face grew serious as he listened. "Aye, that business with the tracking charms was a right mess," he said, shaking his shaggy head. "Should never have happened. Students ought to feel safe at Hogwarts, not like they're specimens in a jar." "We want to learn to protect ourselves," Harry said firmly, "not just rely on adults to decide what's best for us." "Good on ya," Hagrid said approvingly. "Self-defense is important. Let me see that spell you found, Hermione." Hermione showed him the detection charm in her notebook, and Hagrid studied it carefully, his beetle-black eyes moving slowly across the magical formulae. "Sensus observare, eh? That's a good one, that is. Haven't seen it in years, but it's solid magic. Bit tricky for first years, but not impossible if you practice proper." He looked up at them with a thoughtful expression. "Tell you what, I know a few tricks that might help. Things I learned during the war, before you were born." "What kind of tricks?" Ron asked with fascination. Hagrid stood and moved to a wooden chest in the corner of his hut, rummaging through it until he produced a small, carved wooden amulet. "This here's a detection ward. Carved it myself from wood that grew near a fairy ring. Fairies are terrible, suspicious creatures, they are. Their magic naturally repels monitoring and tracking spells." He handed the amulet to Harry, who felt a slight tingling sensation as the wood touched his skin. "Wear this near your heart, and it'll give you a warning if someone tries to cast tracking magic on you. Won't stop powerful dark magic, mind, but it'll alert you to most standard monitoring charms." "You made this yourself?" Hermione asked, examining the intricate carvings with fascination. "Learned wood carving from me, Dad," Hagrid said proudly. "Practical magic, that is. Not all protection comes from wands and fancy spells. Sometimes the old ways work best." Over the next hour, Hagrid taught them several traditional protective techniques that complemented Hermione's book learning. He showed them how to recognize the telltale signs of active monitoring magic, the slight shimmer in the air, the feeling of being watched that was actually magical, rather than psychological, the way shadows fell differently around someone under surveillance. The thing about tracking charms, Hagrid explained as they practiced the detection spells, is that most of them need line of sight or personal connection to work proper. If you know they're there, and you know how they work, you can take steps to limit what they tell their casters. "What do you mean?" Harry asked, practicing the wand movements for the awareness charm. "Well, take emotional monitoring, for example. Those charms read your magical signature when you're feeling strong emotions. But if you practice magical meditation, calming techniques, you can learn to mask your emotional responses from surveillance." Hermione scribbled notes furiously. "So we could potentially neutralize some of the invasive monitoring without actually removing the charms." "Exactly. Of course, it takes practice, and it won't work against really powerful dark magic. But for standard protective monitoring, aye, you can learn to control how much information you're giving up." As the evening progressed, the three friends began to feel something they hadn't experienced since the tracking charm discovery, a sense of agency over their own protection. They were no longer just subjects to be monitored and protected. They were learning to be active participants in their own security. "We should teach this to the other first years," Hermione said, as they prepared to return to the castle. "And the older students, too. Everyone should know how to detect if they're being monitored." "Aye," Hagrid agreed. "Knowledge is the best protection of all. Can't defend against what you don't understand." The walk back to Gryffindor Tower felt different than their journey down to Hagrid's hut. They were returning with tools, both magical and practical, that gave them some measure of control over their own privacy and safety. Over the following days, word spread quietly through the student body about the detection techniques Hermione had researched and the protective methods Hagrid had taught them. Students began meeting in empty classrooms and unused corridors, teaching each other the awareness charm and practicing the meditation techniques that could help mask their emotional signatures from monitoring magic. Percy Weasley, in his role as the student representative to the new Faculty Student Monitoring Committee, reported with satisfaction that students were taking active roles in their own protection rather than simply accepting or resenting adult surveillance. "It's remarkable," he told Professor McGonagall during one of their weekly meetings. "Students feel empowered rather than victimized. They're learning valuable defensive skills, and they're doing so cooperatively rather than in secret defiance of authority." McGonagall nodded approvingly. Self-defense education has always been an important part of magical education. Perhaps we've relied too heavily on external protections rather than teaching students to protect themselves. For Harry, the change was profound. The wooden amulet Hagrid had given him rested against his chest like a talisman of independence, and the knowledge that he could detect new surveillance attempts gave him the first real sense of privacy he'd experienced since learning about the tracking charms. He was still protected, the blood wards remained, and Dumbledore's essential monitoring continued with Harry's grudging consent. But now he was an informed participant in that protection, rather than its unwitting subject. The boy who had lived his entire life under observation was finally learning to watch back. The detection ward Hagrid had carved for Harry began pulsing with urgent warmth against his chest at 11:30 on a cold December night. Harry jolted awake in his four-poster bed, instantly alert as the wooden amulet's warning thrummed through his pajamas. Someone was casting powerful tracking magic somewhere in the castle. "Ron," he whispered urgently, shaking his best friend's shoulder. "Ron, wake up! Something's happening." Ron mumbled incoherently before the urgency in Harry's voice penetrated his sleep. "What? What's wrong?" "The detection ward is going mad," Harry said, pulling on his robes over his pajamas. "Someone's casting major surveillance magic. Now." Within minutes, Harry and Ron had crept through the common room and were making their way through the dark corridors of Hogwarts, following the increasingly intense pulses from the carved amulet. The warmth grew stronger as they descended toward the lower levels of the castle, and by the time they reached the 3rd floor, Harry's chest felt like it was burning. "The 3rd floor corridor," Ron breathed as they rounded a corner and saw light flickering from beneath the door that had been forbidden to students all year. "But it's supposed to be protected by—" A low, rumbling growl echoed through the stone walls, followed by the sound of something massive collapsing. The 3-headed dog that had been guarding the trapdoor was no longer a barrier. Harry's scar began to prickle with familiar pain as they approached the door, and the wooden amulet's pulses became so rapid they almost felt like vibration. "He's in there," Harry said quietly. "Quirrell, and he's using tracking magic to monitor the area, probably to detect if anyone comes after him." "We should get Professor Dumbledore," Ron said, though his voice lacked conviction. They both knew that by the time they found the headmaster and explained the situation, whatever Quirrell was planning would be complete. "No time," Harry said, pushing open the door. "And Ron, we're not just first-year students anymore. We know how to detect and counter surveillance magic. That gives us an advantage Quirrell won't expect." The chamber beyond was exactly as Harry remembered from their previous encounter with Fluffy. Enormous, dimly lit, and now ominously quiet. The 3-headed dog lay unconscious beside the open trapdoor, its massive heads slack with magical sleep. The scent of some powerful potion hung in the air. They descended through the trapdoor into the series of magical protections that guarded the Philosopher's Stone. The Devil's Snare had been burned away, leaving charred remnants. The key room showed signs of violent magical activity, with several winged keys lying broken on the floor. The chess set Ron had defeated weeks earlier in their first encounter with these protections had been blasted apart, the pieces scattered across the chamber. But it was in the final chamber that they found Professor Quirrell standing before the mirror of Erised, his back to them, as he stared desperately into its reflective surface. The nervous, stuttering teacher they knew was gone, replaced by someone whose posture radiated frustrated fury. "Show me the stone," Quirrell snarled at his own reflection. "I know it's in there. The mirror is supposed to show you your heart's desire." Harry felt his scar burning with increasing intensity as they crept closer. The wooden amulet against his chest was pulsing so rapidly now that it felt like a second heartbeat, warning him of the complex web of surveillance magic that surrounded Quirrell. "He's monitoring everything," Harry whispered to Ron, his new knowledge of tracking charms allowing him to interpret what the detection ward was telling him. "Location spells, alarm charms, magical activity sensors. He'll know the moment anyone casts a spell in here." "Then how do we stop him?" Ron asked. "By using something he's not monitoring," Harry replied, remembering Hagrid's lessons about non-magical protection. He stepped out of the shadows, his hand moving to the carved amulet rather than his wand. "Professor Quirrell." Quirrell spun around, his face twisting with rage. "Potter, how did you get past my surveillance network? I had tracking charms covering every approach to this chamber." "You monitored magical approaches," Harry said, surprised by how calm his voice sounded. "But you didn't account for traditional protective methods, or for students who've learned to recognize and counter surveillance magic." Quirrell's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Clever boy. Too clever for your own good. No matter. You're too late. The stone will be mine, momentarily, and then the Dark Lord will return to finish what he started with you." "The stone isn't in the mirror for you," Harry said, the understanding coming to him suddenly. "The mirror shows your heart's desire, but it only gives the stone to someone who wants to find it, but not use it. You want to use it, so you can't have it." Quirrell's face contorted with fury. "Enough! I've spent months monitoring your every move, learning your weaknesses, studying your protections. You cannot defeat me, Potter. I know everything about you." "You know what the tracking charms told you," Harry replied, taking a step closer. "But tracking charms can be deceived. They only show what the target lets them see." As Harry spoke, he was applying the emotional masking techniques Hagrid had taught him, calming his magical signature and controlling his fear. To Quirrell's surveillance magic, he would appear much less threatening than he actually felt. "Your tracking told you that I'm just an 11-year-old boy who relies on adult protection," Harry continued. "But it didn't tell you that I've learned to control what information I give to monitoring spells. It didn't tell you that I understand how surveillance magic works now, and how to use it against the person casting it." Quirrell raised his wand, but Harry was already moving. Instead of reaching for his own wand, he pressed his palm against the carved amulet and whispered the disruption phrase Hagrid had taught him. The detection ward flared with brilliant light, overloading every tracking charm in the chamber and sending feedback through the surveillance network Quirrell had established. Quirrell staggered, his concentration broken as his own monitoring magic turned against him. "Impossible! You're just a child." "A child who's learned not to be helpless," Harry said, finally drawing his wand. "A child who's tired of being watched and studied and treated like a specimen." Quirrell launched a curse at Harry, but as it struck him, the spell rebounded with shocking force. Quirrell screamed and stumbled backward, his hand smoking where the magic had touched him. "You can't touch me," Harry realized, understanding flooding through him. "The protection my mother left me, it's not just in my blood. It's been strengthened by everything I've been through, all the monitoring, all the surveillance, all the attempts to control and study me. They've made the love that protects me burn brighter." Quirrell tried to cast another spell, but his hands were blistering where the rebounded magic had struck him. "No. The Dark Lord told me the boy's protection was fading. The tracking charms showed him growing weaker." "The tracking charms showed what I let them show," Harry said, advancing on his professor, "and Voldemort's understanding of love has always been his greatest weakness." Quirrell's form began to shimmer and dissolve, the possession that had sustained Voldemort's presence finally breaking under the force of Harry's protection. A high, cold scream echoed through the chamber as something dark and insubstantial fled from the disintegrating body, passing through Harry like a freezing wind before vanishing. Quirrell collapsed, his body crumbling to dust as the magic that had held him together finally failed. Harry stood in the sudden silence, breathing heavily, the wooden amulet finally still against his chest. Behind him, Ron was staring in awe and terror at the pile of ash that had been their defense professor. "It's over," Harry said quietly, though he knew it wasn't really over. Voldemort would return someday, in some other form, but the immediate threat was gone, and more importantly, Harry was no longer the helpless subject of other people's protection. Footsteps echoed in the chamber as Dumbledore arrived, his robes billowing behind him. The headmaster took in the scene, the destroyed Quirrell, the mirror of Erised, and Harry standing calmly in the center of it all, with eyes that held both relief and newfound respect. "Harry," Dumbledore said gently, "are you injured?" "No, sir. The protection held." Harry looked up at the headmaster with clear, determined eyes. "And I understand it now, really understand it. The tracking charms, the surveillance, all of it. They never made me safer. They just made me feel helpless. But my mother's love doesn't depend on being monitored or controlled. It depends on being loved and loving others in return." Dumbledore nodded slowly, and for the first time in their relationship, Harry felt like he was being seen as an equal rather than a child to be protected. "Indeed, Harry, and I believe it's time we had a very different conversation about your protection going forward. One where you have rather more say in the matter." As they left the chamber together, Harry felt the weight of constant surveillance finally lifting from his shoulders. The boy who had lived under observation his entire life was finally free to live on his own terms. The end-of-term feast at Hogwarts felt different this year, though Harry couldn't quite put his finger on why, until he noticed the small crystal pendant hanging from a chain around Hermione's neck, a new detection ward carved by Hagrid and given to each student who requested one. Nearly a quarter of the school now wore similar protections, and the sight of them glinting in the candlelight somehow made the Great Hall feel safer and more honest than it had all year. "The new monitoring protocols are working well," Percy announced to their section of the Gryffindor table, consulting a small notebook where he recorded the monthly faculty-student committee reports. Students report feeling more secure, knowing exactly what protective measures are in place, and the faculty reports better cooperation in maintaining necessary safety standards. Harry nodded, unconsciously touching the modified tracking charm that now rested openly against his collarbone, a compromise he'd negotiated with Dumbledore that provided location monitoring and basic health alerts while avoiding the invasive emotional surveillance that had characterized his entire childhood. The charm was visible, voluntary, and most importantly, it included a student override that allowed Harry to temporarily disable non-essential monitoring when he needed genuine privacy. "I still can't believe the Ministry actually changed their policies," Ron said, around a mouthful of treacle tart. "Dad says the new Underage Monitoring Act is the biggest reform of magical child protection laws in 50 years. Arthur Weasley's investigation into the tracking charm network had indeed led to sweeping changes at the Ministry. The discovery that dozens of organizations had been conducting unauthorized surveillance on magical children had prompted a complete overhaul of monitoring regulations, establishing strict oversight procedures and requiring informed consent from both children and their guardians for any tracking beyond the basic trace. The best part," Hermione added, "is that students now have to be taught about magical monitoring as part of their defense against the dark arts curriculum. No more secret surveillance. Children have the right to understand what protections are being used and why." Harry smiled at that. Professor McGonagall had taken over defense teaching after Quirrell's destruction, and her first lesson had been on detection and counter-surveillance techniques. The sight of first-year students learning to recognize tracking charms had been deeply satisfying to Harry, who remembered all too well the helpless feeling of discovering he'd been monitored his entire life without knowing it. "Have you decided what you're going to do about the Dursleys?" Hermione asked quietly, her voice careful. The question of Harry's summer arrangements had become complicated following the surveillance revelations. Harry considered this thoughtfully. The blood protection at Privet Drive remained necessary. Dumbledore had been clear about that, and Harry now understood enough about magical protections to recognize the wisdom in maintaining it. But the discovery of just how thoroughly his suffering there had been observed and ignored had fundamentally changed the dynamic. "I'll go back," Harry said finally. "But this time, I'll have the detection ward Hagrid made for me, and I'll know exactly what monitoring is in place. Plus, the Ministry has assigned a family welfare coordinator to check on me monthly, someone whose job it is to ensure my well-being, rather than just observe my misery." The new arrangement wasn't perfect, but it was honest. Harry would still live with the Dursleys for the blood protection, but he would no longer be a passive victim of either their neglect or well-meaning surveillance. He had tools, knowledge, and allies who would ensure his voice was heard. "And Professor Dumbledore agreed to the communication charm," Ron added with satisfaction. "So if anything goes wrong, Harry can contact us immediately instead of just hoping someone notices something in their monitoring data." That had been perhaps the most important negotiation of all. Harry now carried a discreet two-way communication device that connected him directly to Dumbledore, McGonagall, and his friends. Not for surveillance, but for genuine emergency assistance. It represented the shift from being watched to being supported. As the feast wound down and students began their final preparations for departure the next morning, Harry found himself standing at the window of Gryffindor Tower, looking out over the grounds where he'd spent the most transformative year of his life. "You know," Hermione said, joining him at the window, "I've been thinking about what we learned this year, and it wasn't really about magic at all. It was about power. Who has it, how it's used, and what happens when people don't have enough information to protect themselves." Harry nodded slowly. "I spent my whole life feeling powerless, but it wasn't because I was weak or defenseless. It was because other people were making decisions about my life without including me in them, even when those decisions were meant to help me." Ron flopped down in a nearby chair, his trunk packed and ready for tomorrow's departure. "Do you think Voldemort will try to come back again?" "Probably," Harry said, surprising himself with how calm he felt about that possibility. "But when he does, it won't be the same as before. I won't be the helpless target he's been studying through tracking charms and surveillance. I'll be someone who understands how protection works and has a say in how it's provided." "We all will," Hermione added firmly. "The student council, the new monitoring protocols, the detection training. It's all made Hogwarts a place where students have agency instead of just being protected objects." Harry thought about the months since Halloween, when Madame Pomfrey's scan had revealed the extent of surveillance in his life. The discovery had been devastating, but it had also been the beginning of genuine change. Students throughout Hogwarts now understood their rights regarding magical monitoring. Faculty had learned to include students in decisions about their protection rather than imposing it unilaterally. And the magical community as a whole had been forced to confront the difference between protection and control. "I keep thinking about what Professor McGonagall said in defense class," Harry mused, "that the best protection isn't about hiding from threats or being constantly watched by others. It's about understanding the threats yourself and having the knowledge and tools to respond to them." As if summoned by the mention of her name, Professor McGonagall appeared in the doorway of the common room, her usual stern expression softened by something that might have been pride. "Mr. Potter, Mr. Weasley, Miss Granger," she said formally, then paused. "I wanted to tell you how impressed I've been with your work this year. Not your academic performance, though that has been satisfactory, but your handling of a situation that would have overwhelmed many adult wizards." Harry felt a warmth that had nothing to do with magical protection. "Thank you, Professor. Though I think we made a lot of mistakes along the way." "Mistakes are how we learn," McGonagall replied. "And you've learned something far more valuable than any spell or potion. You've learned to be active participants in your own protection rather than passive recipients of it." After she left, the three friends sat in comfortable silence, watching the last light of day fade over the Forbidden Forest. Tomorrow they would return to their separate homes, but they would do so as changed people. Harry would still face the challenges of being the boy who lived, but he would face them with knowledge, allies, and most importantly, a sense of his own agency. "Same time next year?" Ron asked with a grin. "Same time next year," Harry agreed, though hopefully with fewer life-threatening revelations about surveillance networks. Hermione laughed. "I don't know. I thought it was rather educational." As they headed upstairs to their dormitories for the last time that year, Harry touched the communication charm at his throat and the detection ward Hagrid had carved for him. They were symbols of a new kind of protection, one based on partnership rather than secrecy, knowledge rather than ignorance, and trust rather than control. The boy who lived under constant observation